Malu, could you walk us through your process from working in quantitative behavioral research at JP Morgan Chase to now founding TrendSmith?
Yeah, sure. So, just to step back a bit, I studied economics at Harvard, and I also looked at a bit of the intersection between data science, statistics, behavioral science, and traditional economics. And I had originally started at JP Morgan at kind of an offshoot called the JP Morgan Chase Institute, which was focused on consumer research. So, it looks at the multitude of Chase Bank data, so that's like 50 million users and data points, and tries to create some sort of narratives, policy research, etc., from spending behavior, debt behavior, etc. And that kind of got my interest in quantitative kind of research and how it really, creates cross sections between behavior and economics. Then it was cool, but it's a very academic kind of approach to this field. It was a nice transition from Harvard, but I really wanted to be more involved in product and kind of the profit facing side of JP Morgan. So I transferred to the investment bank, and that's where I worked on quantitative behavioral research. And the team was very interesting. It was an intersection between very finance oriented, economics oriented people, coders, and also people who studied psychology. So it was looking at some sort of fintech products, investment products, and using some tech principles, user research, and behavioral science to understand better about how these fintech products were doing, and taking it a step back, looking at the philosophy, applying studies, applying more philosophical approaches to kind of improve how these products really appealed to institutional clients and investors, etc. And while I really built a lot of my corporate career there and kind of understood how and what processes I'm really interested in, my real goal always was to have something of my own. And I think I've always really been interested in systems and behaviors and how a lot of different factors that aren't really traditionally taught when we look at rational actors in economics really shape how people make decisions and purchasing decisions. And so in the past few years, I've really seen an uptick of things like consumer boycotts and, people really bringing in values, background, identity into how they purchase, right? And we've seen it sometimes with ESG and investing, but I think people are really taking it to the next level and how, realizing how their wallet really reflects their values. And so that's the thesis of TrendSmith, is basically creating a system and platform where people are more enabled and encouraged to, really participate in values-based shopping. So it really provides kind of an ethical snapshot of brands, and it really takes the data background that I've taken, the economics background, applies it, as well as some of the technical background, and gives you like a quick snapshot. So like 30 seconds, 1 minute, can you see like what this brand reflects and what they believe in, what do they spend in, what are their actions, and take it beyond sustainability. Because I feel like there is a lot of focus on sustainability, but there's less on, what do they spend on, what do they donate to, are they accessible, do they care, about XYZ minority communities, what does a founder, identify as. A lot of these things I think are influencing how Gen Z and millennials spend. So that it takes that snapshot, and really is kind of trying to create a new genre of values-based shopping for the conscious consumer. So it's kind of like a cross section, I think, between my interest in behavioral science and economics, and kind of seeing how I can play to that shift in the future and how people are more so showing what they believe in with their wallet. So.
Got it. And what sparked your interest in how consumers make purchasing decisions?
Yeah, I think for me, I it took some of these boycotts of like major corporations or people, divesting or not spending on certain companies when they see it didn't align with what they believed in, for me to be like, wow, like people are really participating in no buy days. Like they're really listening to the trends or listening to the news or seeing how a brand reacts to things, and they are being very vocal and, I will say, active in how they spend. And for me, I think there's a gap because while it's great to be like, okay, I don't believe in this, I won't spend in it. I think what's more powerful is rerouting demand towards, companies that might actually reflect more of like what you would spend on and what you believe in. And I don't really think there is a clear path there, which is why what I'm trying to address is like, okay, let's say you take away the negative impact of your wallet, right? How do you actually create positive impact? And the idea is eventually to create the system where people can actually like look back and be like, in the year I, supported these brands that really reflect XYZ values, or I started boycotting these companies and I shifted that money and that demand elsewhere. And I'm kind of creating and shaping the future of the kind of brands I want to see in the future. So obviously it's a new genre and there's been interest. It's growing, I will say, but it's interesting because I feel like as a product grows, as a genre grows, things shift. And, I see like time and cultural expectations and shifts in news and stuff are very important for me to keep an eye on, right? Because what's relevant from last month might not be relevant to next month. What people are really spending on, next month, people might be really interested in clean beauty and vegan beauty, cruelty-free skincare, right? And so it's like a combination of providing the tools to kind of figure out where I can spend that, matches my values, but also keeping an eye on what people and predicting, right, what people might be interested in next month, and or recommending similar brands with similar values. I think kind of removing the guesswork, if that makes sense, in terms of determining where you would want to spend your money. And while it's definitely like a very specific subset of consumers right now, but I think it's very much based on analytics. I can say like it's definitely a younger crowd who's interested in kind of shifting where they spend. But it's definitely keeping my ear to the ground and understanding how like the needs and expectations of those customers so far will evolve. I think is definitely one of the skill sets I've been learning. So
Got it. And while you were doing quantitative behavioral research,
yeah.
what are some of the most interesting insights that you discovered about human behavior?
Yeah. So actually, I was kind of reflecting on my experience before our call, and I was thinking about it because the quantitative behavioral research between product that I did at the investment bank versus kind of consumer behavior is super interesting. And I think there are different objectives sometimes, right? But when it comes to the economic side of it, I nerded out. It was super interesting because I studied topics like student loan debt and student loan payments, mortgages. How do people really deal with issues of personal finance when it comes to the data we see? What factors really play into it? And so for me, it was really cool, first of all, seeing if you take into mind like all of these different things that take up someone's financial picture, like liquid assets or cash flow, what they spend on, etc. All of those factors are super important when you're even looking at one of these factors. So how do people pay off their student loan debt, you know but also keeping in mind, where are they socioeconomically, right? How do they spend on other certain factors? For me, it was interesting because you could see from our research that like lower income households and younger households have more trouble making more regular student loan payments. And then we saw, you can actually tie families together in Chase Bank data. So you could see that families actually do help a lot of times with student loan payments. And I think those are things that you wouldn't see if you didn't have the scale of kind of data and you didn't bring in the behavioral picture. And then I feel like one of the more interesting things for me too is when you bring in factors like race and gender, et cetera, and you bring in other data sets. So one of the things that we did was look at like voter registration data, where you kind of self-report race, or kind of factors like that. How does that influence the picture? And you do see it's the same thing. Like sometimes minorities and stuff have more trouble paying off student loan debt more regularly, but obviously there's a lot of other factors that go into it, right, in terms of the other questions that we're talking about with liquid assets and income, etc. So it's kind of like the more important lesson learned is that I think no matter how much you think you can account for all variables, you never really can. But I think that's the beauty of intellectual pursuit and curiosity is, right, you'll always kind of figure out how can I paint the picture a bit more. And then I will say sometimes the other interesting research that we did was also like kind of event-based analysis. So let's say with COVID, how did that in fact affect all of these payments when it comes to student loan debt, mortgages, et cetera? And obviously you could see like a big dip, right? Which makes sense. And you could kind of repeat right? It's like a experiment. You repeat the study, right? And you see month after month, was a shock still felt? And the shock was still felt, after COVID really affected people's kind of incomes and liquid assets. I think kind of remembering that not everything is in a vacuum, how people spend, invest, etc. It's very important to take a step back, background. And I know you were talking about in terms of finance and investing, a lot of personal belief, education, etc. It does play a role, but in terms of like neutrality with risk, or are you risk loving, etc. There's a lot of other things that come into the picture. And sometimes I think with the finance picture at the investment bank, we could definitely see, how people, would look at different forecasts, how far in the future would they, look at different forecasts or prediction models that we provided them. Were they really interested in that? You could really see based on, the size of the institution, or, based on kind of like how many assets they manage. There was sometimes a relationship there, right? And so it's interesting because you see it really echo across personal behavior and spending behavior, and also like even large scale institutions, like who is a decision maker there, who's a client that we interface with. A lot of those personal kind of affects, and I guess behaviors really affect and echo institutional kind of effects as well, right? So
Got it. And how has your understanding of data shaped your views on consumer behavior today?
yeah. Well, just disclaimer, I love data. I'm a big data nerd, and I really only realized that, I think, actually at JP Morgan. So that's why I'm really, lucky, because I feel like when you work with big banks and big companies, you have access to a lot of data. I mean, the other side of that is data is always messy, and that's why I feel like technical skill sets. I mean, AI helps with it a lot now, but like having some sense of like, what does a clean data set look like? Because you cannot really make predictions and conclusions from a messy data set. Your predictions and conclusions are going to be very flawed, right? And to be able to really fully stand behind whatever you learn from your data, you really need to get a little nitty gritty with how you deal with data points and how you even assess, like academically. That's the thing about, that's why I feel like even kind of learning about how to process data or data science is helpful for everybody, because it's like, what assumptions went into even collecting the data, right? Can you even predict certain data points if it's missing, right? And a lot of the times when we're working with the Chase Bank data we're talking about, even though it was so large, there was still missing data points, right? Sometimes you would still try to figure out, like, can I model, like, what this, maybe this income bracket, how they spent, if we're missing half the data points, right? And that is it's a big jump to make, but that's I think all of those considerations are important, when you're dealing with the data. And for me, what's interesting with TrendSmith, because I think the first question anyone really asks me is like, okay, like, how do you know a brand is ethical? Which is a very fair question, right? And for me personally, because I came from that academic kind of sense, I was like, okay, there's a bunch of data out there on corporate responsibility, on emissions, on all of this stuff that exists publicly. Like, they have to publish it. Sometimes it's, provided by certain like websites, etc. It's all publicly available. It has to be legally. So I was like, let me use my, technical knowledge to really take a look at it. Again, spoiler, it was very messy. And what I realized is, like, for me, sometimes data does require that qualitative perspective, that behavioral perspective. Because for me, what I realized is these large brands and large companies obviously mostly do the bare minimum when it comes to corporate responsibility and ethics, right? And that's okay, but that's not what I'm trying to provide, right? As a service, we want to go above and beyond just, okay, every company just does the bare minimum, right? Just does enough to be operational and, legally responsible. And so I had to kind of take a step back and be like, okay, if I can't look at just like numerical data points and figure out how a company is ethical, what can I do? And that's kind of where like the market research came in, and really researching some brands. Like, what do they do on their brand websites? How do we look at messaging? They're about us and sustainability. Nobody has time to look at these 20 pages for brands. Really, that's not the point. The thing is making the information accessible, easy to understand, user friendly, but also comprehensive enough that you feel confident enough to make that purchasing decision. And so I kind of I'm also a person that also really believes in diversity of data is super important too, right? Like one data source, is that enough? Because why would you trust fully what a brand says, right? That's another thing. There's a lot of PR and messaging that goes into it. So for me, I also like thought about news and social media, controversy, like scanning for controversy for brands. I think there's a lot of things I learned that are interesting and subjective data points that I could really bring in, that I could meld with my technical standpoint and figure out how to present in a nice user friendly way. I think that was a really important lesson for me, is kind of realizing like I don't want to tell people they should spend XYZ, at a brand. I'm more so focused on providing more information on what values and causes that brand reflects. And that just requires having a diverse and interesting enough set of data points that it like keeps a user interested and ready to come back and ready for it to actually influence purchasing decisions. And that happens with repeated exposure, right? But obviously, I'm sure, in the next year, I will find or figure out more interesting data points and data sets. But that's the thing, is always reevaluating, understanding the quality of the data you represent, or what, users or whoever you're targeting really wants from you, right? And I think that's something I realized with the controversy check, right? Data isn't static either. In the next few months, a brand I may have on my site, right, might experience some controversy. How do I go about presenting that to the user so they still have a topical but also relevant picture of what they're spending on with their money, if that makes sense? So I think like it's interesting working from large data sets and then moving to kind of creating my own data set was a very interesting skill set, and I think it's like something I'm only able to do because of all that time with data. And it's obviously a learning process, but it's kind of interesting like how much it even grows from like month to month. So
Got it. And when you created TrendSmith, what problem in the marketplace were you trying to solve?
yeah. So the problem in the marketplace, I will say, is that people who especially were boycotting or looking to spend on brands don't know. And it's a thing I've seen widely reflected on like socials, on user interviews, etc. Is kind of just like people just don't know where to spend. Like they know, right, big names, right, big brands that are, I feel like, flaunted all the time, but people who are more intentional with purchasing don't really understand where to go, and they don't want to spend a lot of time. People don't have the time, right? And so it's like there is a growing need for those kind of intentional and conscious consumers to find a place to land their money. Even in an economy like this, I think like people are very, even maybe more intentional about how they spend, is what I've realized. So like for me, there's such an oversaturation of brands nowadays, especially if you look at independent indie brands, etc., that aren't getting, a platform that people don't know about. And I think that's something I've realized as I surface TrendSmith, is like there's a gap there. I'm kind of serving as like a middle woman, if that makes sense, right? Kind of transporting that messaging from brands in a way that's really digestible to users that people can relate to. So for me, like this is just a brief example, right? So let's say topically, there were a lot of conversations about immigration. A lot of people were like, how do I support immigrant communities and, immigrant businesses? And that's something where I kind of stepped in. I was like, okay, there's two spheres, right? One thing I realized that was interesting as I developed this is not just like values and causes, but who's behind a company or brand, right? Sometimes people like to spend with people who have something in common with them, right? Whether it's, oh, I want to support a woman-owned business, right? I want to support, someone from the same community. And that's something that came into the data that we were talking about as I realized there's no real like quick way to find some of these things. And so that's something I've added, but that's just an idea. There's two things, right? How has a brand showed that they support immigrant rights? So sometimes people, they donate to certain causes, right? That's a good signal. Or they, have certain collections about immigrants, or they bring it to the runway. Because right now I've been focusing on fashion and beauty because I think it's really reflective of identity, values, and causes as we're talking about. And it's a great starting point to create the conversation and then kind of echo in other sectors. But for me, that's one sphere. And then the other sphere is like, okay, immigrant founded brands, right? That's another thing that people would love to support economically. So it's kind of like, it's interesting. That's why I mean, keeping my ears to the ground is very important because it's very important to see what people care about now, what people are like, okay, like this brand, they donate XYZ to maybe organizations that are not supportive of immigrants, or when we talk about politics and being aware of the socio-political conversation is creating like kind of that avenue for people to support alternative sorts of brands. That's kind of the cause that I was trying to address with this, and so far I have seen like good responses to it. The thing is though, being really kind of keen to understand what's topical and how can I really surface that in a way that's kind of is emotionally evocative, if that makes sense as well. So
Yeah, that makes sense, Malu. And what are some key errors that you commonly see from consumers when they're deciding which brands to spend money with?
yeah, key errors is, well, this is what's interesting, and I think this is a theme I think I've come upon, because I think if you thought like 50 years ago, for example, or even 10 years ago, brand loyalty was a big thing, right? Like people like, I spent at this store, my parents spent at this store, I'm going to keep supporting this store, and that's cool. But the way that companies have evolved nowadays is like they're massive, right? And there's usually like a few companies that have a large share of certain things. Like when we talk about clothing, especially, and that's one thing I realized when I looked at the data, right? It's like parent company, holding company, child companies. I didn't even know until I started looking at the data how many brands that we look at are all owned by the same company. And so the thing is that I wouldn't even say like that's user error. It's just like the asymmetrical information of it all, right? And that really brings it back to the economics, because like if you don't have that data, or it's not easily available until you tool around with it for an hour, that's not like a super transparent way, right, to go about purchasing. And I think it's the way that consumption happens nowadays. It's usually in these large companies' favors to maybe not make it as transparent, right? Because it's like if I'm boycotting company A, but I don't know company B is also under the same ownership, right? Like, and that's not transparent, then am I actually making any impact? While, if I still spend with that other company that's owned, that has owned by the company that has the same values I'm trying to boycott. And that's the thing, is the information is not really transparent, and companies aren't really forced to be accountable in a certain way. And that makes sense. It's all you can't really enforce these things ethically and culturally. It's just the free market, right? But I do think that people should have the ability to have access to that information. And so I think the key error is that people just don't research, or they can't be bothered to research. So the thing is that's interesting is that we're just trying to make that easier. So even that people in the gray area who are like, oh man, I feel kind of iffy, like, about supporting this brand, but it doesn't influence me enough that like if I have this need, I'll still purchase from them, right? We're just trying to kind of shift the momentum such that we make it easy enough that if you're in the gray area, here's a recommendation, and it's like a good enough substitute that, and you feel like that added kind of emotional bonus or ethical kind of thing of like, oh, I'm supporting like a brand I feel good supporting. That's kind of like the goal eventually, is to kind of like shift the compass, culturally, in a way that makes it easier and more compelling to shop more ethically or be a more conscious consumer. So it's like the truth is I can't ever blame consumer user like that, because that's something I learned at trying to found this, is like it is such a very like ambiguous and oversaturated and overwhelming area, right, of information, especially with the digital age, that, like, to be honest, I understand why there's a need to support the same thing, or like something you're used to or comfortable with. And that's the idea, is too, that this genre also has to do with brand discovery, right? Like that people also just want to know about different brands and new brands. It's just, if it's not in the popular news, or if it's not something that's maybe in their little consortium of friends, or somebody wouldn't bring up, then how would you even discover that brand? I think it's hard, if you think about SEO and Google and stuff. Even if I Google ethical brands, it's just like, people who just write ethical 50 times, right? Or even if you think about greenwashing as a concept, where people, just they say they're sustainable, they say they're eco-friendly, but what is the proof? I think that's the thing too, is also taking a brand at face value. But we've been taught to do that a lot of times, right? We've been taught that consumer trust and transparency is like expected, right, sometimes. But I do think there is a bit of like a fallacy, as we're learning, that it's not in the company's interest to always be super transparent or accountable. And that's something interesting, is like I've seen even in the US versus abroad. If you look at the EU, sometimes there's more kind of regulations about consumer transparency and accountability there. And so like even as I kind of examine different markets and I've kind of incorporated some European brands, for example, on the TrendSmith, and like this is interesting because it feels like even the floor is a bit higher when cultural expectations are different. So it can even really evolve from place to place. But I think especially in the US now, I'm seeing like people are more willing to experiment with what sort of brands they want to support, but they just don't know where to go. And the research, as somebody who's now done the research, it's very complicated. And I'm not saying anyone could do it, but it's like, is it actually worth the time? Or is there diminishing marginal returns as if you're looking at like the fourth brand to consider and compare, right? And the idea is to take out the effort, take out that the kind of the oh man the indecisiveness, right, of where I should spend next. And I think the other thing that I've been working on as it's kind of rolling out soon is kind of also being more product oriented, right, thinking of more shopping categories rather than just a brand. Like if I really need a dress, right, like where do I buy from? And I think that's something I'm trying to also bridge the gap to make that shopping decision faster, is not just taking the brand story but like curating a little bit more, like okay, here like the different categories of shopping that might be more, speed up the process, make it easier for you to actually press that shop button instead of like agonizing for a week, and being like, is it worth it? Do I feel good supporting this brand? So there's a long-winded way of saying that it's like a complicated kind of sphere of information, and it's not in the consumer's interest sometimes to spend that much time researching or decoding what a brand means, which is why I think a lot of this is like translating, right? TrendSmith really translates kind of like the ethics and values of a company and what it stands for, or the kind of consumers it wants to support. So
Got it. And how does a TrendSmith help clients cut through noise to find those brands that align with their values?
yeah, so I will say I've tried to make it as user friendly as possible, because for me, I think people like exploring when they're shopping. If you think it's like very like hunter gatherer kind of, people really like to kind of weed through different brands or filter by different things. If you think about it, people that I think that's why that functionality is available on so many shopping websites nowadays, right? And so for me, I was like, yeah, it's cool to have shopping categories. That's something I definitely am working on. But for the thesis of my thing is that people want to pick different causes, values, or founder identities that they really care about, and they can immediately see like, okay, here are 20 women founded businesses you can support, right? And they also care about XYZ value or cause. And then we're adding in the shopping category there, but I think making it the data easy to read, easy to understand. So for example, I've kind of categorized, I have a hero, so like, why did we choose this brand? And for me, I've picked a super positive signal or action ethically, right? Whether it's donation to charity, right? Something like that actually like caught my eye. Like, why did I curate this brand? Because I think that really kind of is like a quick attention grabber, if that makes sense. And then I kind of categorize the other kind of ethical factors that we're talking about, right? Like, how do they produce? Like, what are their processes? Are they cruelty free, et cetera? Are they sustainable? But also, what are their values and commitments in terms of, how inclusive how they are, how diverse they are. And I've categorized it in like, let's say like 9 bullets max, right? You don't really have to get there to the end to understand if it's something that you believe in, but it does provide enough information. And I have sources, right? And I think that's the one thing I'm talking about. I'm not like a certification agency, but I am somebody who does care in like the robustness of information, right? That is important to me because again, I'm also a brand, right? I'm also a company, and I also need to cultivate consumer trust. But having it in the data in a very clear, easy way, being able to trace the line back to where I got the data and information from, I think that makes it easier. So someone who actually does care can always go click in and investigate and read, right? And then also having kind of the categorizations on the homepage. That's the thing with coding and developing this all by myself. It's very interesting trying to think about user experience, right? And being like, okay, if it were me, or even like talking to other people who looked at the website, like what are causes or values that are topical, that are relevant, that people care about, that I can feature, that so you can just kind of click and see like an array of shops to look at, right? So like the things we are talking about, like immigrant rights, or they care about sustainability, cruelty free, those sort of things, women founded, black founded, like all of those kind of identities and values and causes I've categorized for ease of browsing, if that makes sense. So that's how I kind of cut through the noise. Is I've categorized it as much as I think it's humanly possible, and categorize the ethics even, like that you can click on a tag. Let's say this is a good topic. So people talk about cultural appropriation, right? And they boycott brands that, maybe misrepresent or offensive about certain cultures. So the opposite of that, cultural appreciation, a cultural, a representation. So that's another positive signal kind of spin on it. You can click on that, and maybe so you can see, like Native American founded brands that really celebrate their culture, right? So every kind of feature on TrendSmith is interactive, is clickable, is explorable, and also what the most important thing I think also is recommendations. So you can save brands. You can I also recommend brands based on what you've browsed, what you've clicked on, what you've saved as well. So that really cuts through the noise, right? Because if I can see that you're interested in XYZ value cause or woman founded brands, I can easily tell you're probably also interested in these three other brands, right? And so I think all of the things, like the user friendliness, and user experience is always easier when you give like possibilities, when you fill in the blanks, right? And you don't make someone think like, oh, where do I go next, right? And then obviously the most important thing is action, right? And having calls to action all over, right? So buttons that you can click and explore the site. You can, share about the brand, the kind of like ethical scorecard, I would call it, or snapshot. But all of these kind of, the shopping has to be easy, right? And that's one thing I'm kind of featuring soon, is like the actual products that I feature and curate, that will help take that to the next level, where it's like, oh, okay, I like this brand. Here's one thing I would like, that from there, that makes it easy to click and explore that site. It's kind of like making the decision process more decisive and giving, maybe three curated possibilities for you, instead of giving, okay, here, go explore the site, and like all its 500 pages. Because I don't think, if someone had that time, then they wouldn't even use this tool at all, right?
Got it. And um, from your perspective, have you seen any generational differences in consumer preferences?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, I mean, most of all, I've seen most millennial and Gen Z interest in TrendSmith, and repeated users from those generations. I think that makes sense with the kind of facets of social media I've seen. For example, I've seen a lot of interest on TikTok, right? A little less on Instagram, more on TikTok. People really love cause related videos. So, like, here's these: if you're boycotting for Palestine, here are like 5 Palestinian brands to support. People really like to the call to action. Like, here's X that you care about, then here's Y brands you can support. And my thing is, again, no judgment calls. I don't tell you what to support, but here's the thesis, and here's a few brands. If you want more brands, check out TrendSmith. I have, it categorized by these causes. And I have really seen a lot of Gen Z people really respond there and be like, oh man, I really needed this tool because like I was boycotting and I didn't know where to spend, and kind of that desire to create positive impact, and instead of just abstaining from spending, if that makes sense. And then interestingly, I mean, older generations I do see clicks, but I will say it's a little more sporadic, right? It's based on, I think they are more interested in a little more in like founder identity of the brand and stuff, like who's behind the brand. And that makes sense, because I feel like sometimes it's a question of community or a cause, right? Some people are more called by community and how they can support people in their own community, which is, I think, super interesting, generationally. But overall, I would say that is the case generationally. And then internationally, I've also seen a lot. That's part of the reason I'm in France right now, is because I've seen interest in Europe. I have some UK based brands already on the side, and I have interest from some French brands. So I think like it's interesting. This is a good example. I don't know if you saw like Shein. They tried to open up a storefront in Paris, and it was boycotted and completely shut down. And that's like the perfect example for me, like these kind of events that show like there's a real market here, right? There's a market for people who like don't want to support fast fashion, who don't want to, really kind of buy into what's trendy or like, what's cheaper right now always. That's the other thing. And I'm getting a little carried away, but the point is eventually I want to not only reroute demand to these kind of more ethical brands or brands that people see themselves in, but also grow them in a way that it makes it easier financially to support these things. So if we bring in financial rewards and eventually kind of like a fintech angle, that's kind of what I'm gearing towards, because I think if you think about it, sustainable companies, et cetera, like usually the processes and making the products are more expensive, right? Like there's usually premium, and people, it's harder, right? If you give me $150 thing that's more ethically made versus $100 thing that's less ethically made, a lot of people will just pick the $100, right? So my thing is like, what is the gap there, and how can I help with it? Is eventually creating financial rewards, and whether that has to do, with discounts, cashback, etc., exploring that space, and understanding, again, it requires some more repeated exposure to the concept before I kind of roll that out at scale. But I think the most interesting thing for me is like, how can people not only feel good, but also their wallet feels good, right? Like they're not struggling because they're supporting more ethical brands. They're actually at least rewarded in a way that makes it not level set to supporting a less ethical brand, right? If financially. And The other thing I will say that probably will affect the generational gap you were talking about is I've always been interested in gamifying it a bit, because I do think like people really do respond to that dopamine, of like, oh, I feel good about supporting XYZ brand. I get points. You know what I mean? I like creating a community, creating kind of that sense of goodwill. Oh, I want to keep supporting these good brands. I want to keep getting the points, and that kind of might play into the fintech angle later as well, because if you think about people like to feel good, right? That's what they say, is like sometimes there's no true altruism because people like to feel good by being more ethical, by doing good deeds. And so the idea is like playing into it where it's a little more addictive to spend on better brands, where you feel good, where you can look back and you can see progress from year to year or like month to month. Like, I supported XYZ more ethical brands, how am I rewarded for that? And I think that generationally, maybe there will be even more of a boost with these younger generations, because I think we've seen it. People really respond to that in younger generations, right? People like the kind of the feeling, the game, the rush of it all. And I think that it just feels like even more of a positive experience, rather than right now. It does feel a little more like curated and editorial, and so I want to make it even more interactive, if that makes sense. So
Got it. Makes sense, Malu. And how does TrendSmith help the clients use data to figure out what is important to them in terms of their values, and then being able to map that to the consumer brand that's appropriate for them?
yeah. So that's why I think the exploration factor is important for this, because it's a new concept. Is because there are a bunch of values and there are a bunch of causes, and obviously I've curated, some of them, but it's not going to be like expansive right now with the number of brands I have, right? And the idea is to scale the number of brands and increase the optionality of the amounts of values and causes that you can really pick and choose from, right? But for me, like if I was curious, about this ethical brand idea, or curious about maybe what values are really feel to that call to action, that's why I feel like the carousels that I have of like trending popular brands are really helpful. Like, what do other people really believe in right now? What are they clicking on? That's kind of what I have featured, and that really helps people at least explore, click, and see what is common between these things that they might believe in. But also, I think clicking around and seeing the brand card, I do think it's important, because if you look, it'll say like, the way I've done it is kind of like, that's what I mean, the translating thing. So let's say someone has like 5 paragraphs about like how they're sustainable and cruelty free and vegan. Like, what can I pull out of there? For me, it's like the keywords and stuff, and that's how I process the data. Right, is pulling out these keywords and these tags, because people really respond if you say cruelty free versus like, we do not use any processes that affect any animals, right? So my thing is like having these little kind of tidbits of ethical kind of value are really helpful for people to explore what really beckons them, if that makes sense, while having a little more detail in a bullet for somebody who's just like, okay, like what are they talking about? How do they know it's cruelty free? Right? How do they know? What is the citation? What is the kind of information that really exists there? So part of it is like that's why I keep saying repeated exposure, because it's true. Like if you don't have understand this genre, the more you click around though, the more you understand the genre, the more you explore brands, the more you understand the commonalities, right? And like what values are really important to people right now, even because you can tell that's a lot of times why people have them on their website. And one interesting thing I learned too is like a lot of these smaller brands and companies, they don't always surface these things of ethical value on their website, which is really, really fascinating to me, because I'm like, for me, I'm like, as a late Gen Z person, I would be like, okay, like I'm really interested in this thing. Why do you have it borrowed in your like footer? Right? Like why do you not have it as a headline? Because for somebody who's a conscious consumer, they want to see that upfront. And that's something I'm learning is like people who are looking for those things of ethical value, while I'm also making it more clear to people, there's also some work on the brand side as well, right? Because the brands don't really surface all this information clearly. Again, it is my job to find it, but eventually that's the thing, as I partner with brands, is also teaching them like these things were really important to these younger consumers. If you don't surface it, no one's going to find it. Also, search engines won't find it, right? If you put, you donated all proceeds from a day to an organization, you just put it on like an Instagram text post, that doesn't, no one picks that up. SEO won't pick that up if you don't put it, like on your website. So I think like it's interesting because it's like, it's kind of like I'm like a treasure hunter trying to find these little value, things of ethical treasures that people want to see that like are positive and they want to support. But it's like a gold mine, and then picking out what people really want to see is my job as a curator, if that makes sense. But it's also like that's the thing, as this evolves, I've seen like actually some brands have, that I've worked with have actually improved kind of like the signals they're putting out on their website, if that makes sense. So that's the thing, I'm trying to like change the conversation. And a lot of that, it's like if you don't know what to look for, I'm trying to help with that, right? And even as I've talked to some people and stuff, they'll be like, oh, I'm really interested in XYZ tag, right? And that's influenced what kind of future brands I partner with. So that's the importance of user interviews, et cetera, right? But making the information easy, accessible, but also explorable and not too limiting, I think is important because it's a new genre of shopping, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Got it. And how has technology helped us understand consumer behavior better over the years?
Yeah, that is a good question. So when I think of consumer behavior, I think like, to be honest, the digital age has transformed everything, of course. And that's why I think like even thinking about ethics, values, corporate responsibility, et cetera, the picture has changed a lot, because a lot of these things, it wasn't required of people to share that from, when they build their brands, or and as they're growing their brands, they're realizing it's important. But it's kind of like a race to just do again the bare minimum. And I think like consumer behavior has become more informed, right? Because the digital age has kind of bridged the gap, in asymmetrical information a little more, if that makes sense. Because you're kind of able to see all those like sustainability points, all these emissions things, all the CO2 things, like all those things weren't widely available. Like 50 years ago. First of all, like that's what I mean. The time is very important, right? Like emissions as a concept, or CO2 emissions and climate change weren't in like the topic of conversation a while ago, right? And so it's important to kind of keep an eye on, as people become more aware of how things are produced, or how brands cater to people, or like the importance of, even as the world grows more diverse, as people get more ability to have and own brands and have different products. I think like access to this information has changed a lot, but also like even like media literacy and things have changed, and people are growing more aware of what brands support, right? And so I think over time, and with the increase of like a more advanced technology, people are becoming smarter about how they consume, and even brands are becoming more smart about how they represent themselves. But I think there's a, that gap still exists, and it grows. I think it grows because, I mean, if you think about it, there's a lot of consumers and there's a lot of brands, and brands probably also, if you think, also just tend to advertise or market what they think people will like, and that's the importance of the analytics I see, and kind of partnering with brands too, is me being like, like people came to your brand because of this one minute thing you have on your site. This one cause that you mention on like the 50th page here, right? I'm like, maybe it's important for you to know that if you spend more time growing that, or like surfacing that value on your site, or create more products around it, when in terms of, or market to consumers more about social media about that might help you even like target that market even more. So I think like the thing is, over time, consumer behavior has changed, but brand behavior has changed a lot as well. And it's more easy to start a brand. It's more easy to create a brand and create products. It's just true, right? And so right now, obviously, I'm dealing more with like physical products and things like that people make, and it's more easy to track, the things we're talking about in terms of values, because production, factories, all those things, all the transparency is more apparent nowadays. But it's interesting if you think about different sectors, you know digital forward or like tech companies, right? Like, how do you define ethics there? That's a whole other sphere that I hope to encounter one day soon. But if you think about it, like, how deep are you going into the question of ethics? It's very interesting. For each consumer, it's very different. Like, if you think about tech, but it's like, okay, like, how do they source their chips? Where do they mine for the the stuff that goes into the chips? Like, people have thought that far into it, and that was what was surprising to me. Even thinking about ethical brands, what ethics do consumers care about? It's expanded as people learn more about production, as people learn more about like what brands care about and how they grow their brands. Like, people care about how brands scale, right? They'll be like, oh man, like 10 years ago, this brand used to care. Like, they used to do this thing. Like, everything is very public now. Everything is very, it's hard to get away with more as a company. And I think that's the interesting thing is like, with the information age, with the digital age, transparency is becoming increasingly more expected, and trust has to be built more because it's easier to cut corners, right? So just as you scale and as you grow as a company. So that's why I think it's interesting. Obviously, I've surfaced smaller brands, right? But as I've worked with more mid-sized brands, it's interesting because sometimes it's less in their interest to be transparent about XYZ, right? And you might have to interrogate that. You might be like, does this fit the quality of the brand that we would have on our site? And that's something else to think about too, is when we bring in something I'm working on is really like comparing two brands, right? A little more upfront, like, okay, these are the same kind of, they're both beauty brands, or they're both say they're cruelty free, but what are the other things that are a differentiator? And letting someone compare, like, one product versus one product, one brand versus one brand, I think that makes the decision easier. So I think it's right. Information overload, it's overwhelming. That's the thesis of it all. But ideally, it's like that's why this is a more digital tech forward product. It's like, it's easier for me to weed it through the information with my experience, and I hope to make that easier for the consumer as well. So
Got it. And what trends do you see driving consumer behavior over the next decade?
okay, that's a good question. So over the next decade, um, I think that's a theme you've probably heard, is like, politics has come to the forefront, and things like, kind of, do brands reflect the consumers that they're selling to? And so when we talk about like, um, not just politics, right? We talked about like, oh, the ethics of immigrants or whatever causes you're aligned to. It's also like your products. So if we think about beauty and skincare, is really interesting. I will say, especially as a woman of color, because if you think about like cosmetics and stuff, sometimes even like 15 years ago, it's hard for, let's say, like my mom to find makeup that match her shape, right? And so inclusivity and diversity are really growing, not even just as like a thesis for like, oh, our company cares about our team being diverse, right? Obviously important, people care about that too. Like, oh, you don't have women leadership, right? This is something we hear about a lot, right? Or you don't have people of color in your leadership, in your board. And, that's something we see with bigger companies. But also the other side of that is like, for consumers, are they listening to consumers? Are the brand listening to the consumers as they put out a new product, as they put out new shades, new kinds of things? Or, we talk about accessibility and inclusivity. And it's funny, like, because I would say, like, literally 10 years ago, if you said all this stuff, people would laugh, right? They'd be like, yeah, brands, they don't really care about that. They just want to sell stuff. But the thing is, like, it is profitable to cater to more people. It just is sometimes, right? And it's like, having those as signals, but also listening to consumers and evolving your product and evolving your mission, it's important. And I think that's a fallacy. A lot of brands think like what worked 10 years ago will work for them now, and that's why you're seeing the boycotts working, right? And I think those things, those ideas, diversity, inclusivity, accessibility, it seems like a lot of buzzwords to a lot of people, but the truth is like as a consumer, people just really care about like, can I see myself supporting this brand in 1 year? Will they have products for me? Are they listening to me when I said like it doesn't fit me, or like they don't have things for people who are a little curvier or like plus size, right? Like people are more accountable because they're holding these brands more accountable because they know that brands can hear them, right? That's the thing about the digital and information age we're talking about. Like the information channel is way more clear. Like people get canceled, brands get canceled, boycotted way more often. So I think one of the key things we'll see in the next up and coming age is like the trend is accountability matters, right? No one's perfect, no brand is perfect, and that's why even when I design TrendSmith, there's a lot of sites. I don't know if you've heard of like Good on You or Yuka and things like that. It's very like ratings oriented, if that makes sense. It'll be like 60 out of 100, which is okay. But if you think about it, what like a brand doesn't always have an incentive to have a conversation or be better, right? If you're like punitive, it's just true. So that's my thing in like even when I design this, it's like it shouldn't be punitive. It should be a conversation. It should be a continuous process of improving accountability, transparency, and consumer trust. And I think that's a trend we'll see soon is that consumers care more about how you react to a controversy, how you adapt to changing customer bases or trends in the world, rather than like you did something wrong, it's the end of the world, we'll never buy from you again. It's like we hear you, consumer, we're going to do something to change either a product or a mission, etc. And that's what I think, the idea being that consumers like their voice being heard and they like seeing a response from brands, right? And I think the idea, because of all this optionality of the oversaturation of brands and company statistics in the world, it's very easy to switch, right? There's so many substitutes that exist, right? And so people cannot brands can no longer be like, oh, they bought from me for this long, they'll do it again. They don't have to anymore, right? They don't have to, especially with everything, click away. So I think as brands adapt and as they scale, or even new brands come along, the way that they respond to consumer conversations will literally be an indicator of if they survive or if they even grow, I think. So yeah.
Got it. And what are some errors you see from corporations where they think the consumer wants something, but they make an they make an error in that assessment? Are there consistent themes you see there?
uh Yes, I think that there's two things. There's two kinds of errors here. I think either the older companies, the companies that have been around for a while, it's kind of like they not responding to the consumer, as I talked about, and putting out the same thing, not evolving product, not evolving their brand. Because if you think about it, like a customer 50 years ago is not the same as a customer now, and the brand should think the same way is a thing. And that's why it's so important to look at analytics and sales, but also not just look at by demographic, look by socioeconomic background, by race. I'm sure with the data and privacy things we have nowadays, you can see all of it. That's the thing, you can see all of it. So if you're choosing not to see which markets are underrepresented in your clientele, etc., you are losing out. You're going to lose the race. And so for people who don't evolve their products, we were talking about the shade range issue. It's a perfect example. Like if you don't evolve your products, like there's literally no reason to stick with that. There are a lot of new and upcoming. That's what I mean with founder identity too. You can see like Black founded brands, or like POC founded brands have more shade range representation and things like that, right? Because it's true, the founder went through it themselves. That's why they made the line, right? And so I think like the idea that being that it's worked for so long, it'll work now, is not true. So I think that's a big error. And then also sometimes don't break what's already working, if that makes sense, right? People seeing things have worked for a reason in terms of products. They're best sellers for a reason, but I think there's so much focus on over evolving products, if that makes sense, and not like understanding that people do like to go to certain brands for certain things. And people do have like safe choices, if that makes sense. And I mean, that's the thing you even see across like tech products, right? People do so many updates, features. It's the same thing with if you think of consumer products too. People like change packaging and they don't understand that these little things that what seems little to them is super important to the customer. There's a reason it works, right? And or taking away taking it off the market and things like that. I've seen a lot of like dismay, and that's where I think that's an interesting angle potentially for TrendSmith, is also keeping an eye on like things are discontinued, things are not like no longer working. What is a substitute from like a brand that could also work as well? And that's at the product level. Like I think consistency is important, but like exploring how consumers are changing and stuff, you have to keep some authentic brand voice but be open to evolving. And I think that's the issue. And the common error is just the ego, right? The ego to not listen to the customer. And then the idea that like anything new is better, or this brand is doing that, let me copy it. That's not what people like, actually. What they like is authentic and consistent and reliable products, right? And so when people, the best brands I see that like, some of the bigger brands that I worked with, is like they've done the same thing over 10 years. They focus, like, this is a good example, clean ingredient skincare, right? That's the thing. People put a lot of preservatives, alcohol, things that irritate people, and it's very difficult. Like, even for me, this is a good example. Like, I have a lot of allergies, so I have to research the ingredients very explicitly. For example, there's a big market of people who go to these newer brands who've been around for like maybe 5 to 10 years, but the reason they're succeeding is because they keep a simple formula. They don't change it, right? They have 5 flagship products: a cleaner, cleanser, a cream, etc. And it works and it grows, and it's even like expanding to different markets overseas, because sometimes it's like simplicity is also good if it works. And that's another lesson I think a lot of brands don't understand, that sometimes like expanding your product line just for the sake of novelty doesn't always pay off either. So
Got it. And how can corporations position themselves better to connect with consumers in an increasingly data-rich world?
yeah, I think it's interesting. I think with the advent of social media and active social media, and you see a lot of Gen Z and millennials too, like they do like people who listen to their comments and concerns, and actually engage with customers. And I think that's what I mean. Qualitative data. It's terrible to weed through, of course, but if you see like the brands that get canceled, or like people start moving away from it, it's the ones that don't listen. They don't listen, they don't respond. And I think that's a good qualitative data set. That's important. That we were talking about behavior, like people say why they're disgruntled. That's the thing. And obviously it's a spectrum. The people who are most unhappy with it and the people who are most happy with it, you'll hear that on social media, but it's important to listen to. So that's one data aspect I think is very ignored nowadays. But you can see, that's what I mean, like the TikTok, Instagram stuff. Like if you look at a brand's products and you look at the comments, it's crazy how much you can learn from it, right? It's crazy. It's like even Reddit, like it's crazy. So that's a qualitative data set I think is overlooked often, but you can see a lot of the younger brands with good social media teams and analytics teams catch that fast, right? You can see like people literally put out a product next week that caters to the concerns that were expressed there. But in terms of like the other data that we're talking about in terms of values, mission, etc., I think people, I don't want to click 20 times to find what you believe in. I think that's an important thing, because I think they do it out of functionality, a lot of the websites, and the ways the brands represent themselves, but surfacing their missions in a way that's like not not like obfuscated. It's not complicated language. Just making it like very easy to understand who you are and what you believe in as a brand is super important. Because I just think like that sometimes can be make it or break it in what we're talking about with things shifting towards value-based shopping, right? So I think the more you surface it, I'm not saying repeat yourself 20 times, but I'm saying like, what are ways you can weave in your values to your product? So this is like the perfect example I was talking about. It's like, I didn't even know how many brands there are that like donate like X% of proceeds to a certain cause for a certain line or collection. And that's a very sustainable way to give back, right? Without like totally gutting your profits, right? Like 1%, I saw this cool company, 1%, to the nonprofit of your choice when you check out. Like, and I wouldn't know that unless I clicked 15 times on their page, right? And so for me, this is what I mean about surfacing ethical signals and like data for people is like you need to think about every consumer, the people who are used to you, the people who are on in the gray area, and the people who are looking to discover you. And that's the thing about the brand discovery we're talking about. And if you put that on your homepage, if you put it in your product lines and your names, it's going to show up in other places. It's going to show up in SEO, right? So the thing is, like, people underestimate how much data really lives in their site and also on their socials, but also how much consumers crave that. To be honest, they like to research. They do enjoy it. But the idea being like we only have certain tools at our disposal. We only have a few search engines and AIs and things, right? Like no one is going to go the extra mile. So the more you feature the things that make you an ethical or good brand, the more it benefits you. Even and you will see like even better returns as things shift in like the next 5 years, I think, right? People look back and be like, they've been saying this since 2 years ago, right? And that's the thing of TrendSmith is also creating that time progression and showing like this brand has really believed in this for this long, or like they've really improved in this area since last year. It's kind of the next level there. And that's what I mean. Data and bringing in time into data is very important in any time series, right? Like it's way more informative, again, about how a brand acts or also like what consumers believe in. So
Got it. And as you look back over your career, Malu,
yeah.
what are some of the most important skills that you learned at JP Morgan Chase that have influenced how you run TrendSmith today?
Yeah, most important skills. We already rehashed the data a lot, but working with data, but also it sounds weird, but like questioning all your assumptions when you work with anything technical or anything number related is like, where did we get these numbers from? How are they produced? What are the possible errors that come with these numbers, right? Or if I model or if I make predictions, what are possible pitfalls? It's just kind of thinking about past me, present me, and future me, right? Whenever you do anything technical or data oriented, you have to think about when I did this or when I coded this or when I do anything, like what are potential assumptions I made, right? It's kind of like stopping your ego at every point to make sure whatever you produce is the most accurate it can be, and you challenge every assumption that you can make. Because if you think about it, like there's a high intellectual rigor at organizations like that. You have to be willing and able to defend whatever conclusions you come up with, the reports you put out, right? Especially with investors, clients, consumers. And at the institute, we interface a lot with public policy people. If you think about it, these are people with like multiple PhDs and doctorates, right? And I'm a person with a bachelor's, right? So I have to really be rigorous. It's intellectual rigor. I think it's something that also carried on from college that's really challenged there. But the idea that also I will say that's you the idea that you don't know everything and you're not always the smartest person in the room. I think that's the most important thing I've learned from these institutions too, is like even ethically, if I think I know what's ethical, maybe I don't know there's like two other things that people who are way more on the radar would actually care about or research. It's always being open-minded, always doing the research and being up to date. And that's what I mean, like reading what people are saying, researching what people are saying in terms of the brands we're talking about. I think that's always important. And I think otherwise it's very easy for a product to get static. And, it's a very easy for lack of growth and scale if you don't really question like, okay, but we built this a month ago, but like what do people want for the next month, right? It's like always keeping an ear to the ground. That's something that I think cared, even with, we were working with institutional clients and investors, like people are demanding, they care a lot, and consumers are the same way, right? They really expect a lot from the products they use and the services they use. Otherwise, even if I ever want people to pay for from the consumer side, people are not willing to pay unless it's a very high quality product that consistently delivers, right? And so that's that research and showing that consumer trust and building that consumer trust comes a lot from the same thing, building trust with clients, institutional clients, and investors. It's very much the same skill set, right? Communication, transparency, accountability, all the values that really matter, I think, in both spheres. So I am grateful that I got those skills from there, for sure.
Got it. And what advice would you give to those looking to leave a large institution to start a company from scratch?
Yeah, it's a large decision. It's this is what I meant about risk loving, risk neutral stuff for me personally, and I think you mentioned this as well. It's like because I took the safe path a lot of my life. It's because I thrive well in structure, but the idea being that sometimes if you don't challenge yourself, you'll never know what you're capable of. That that you can even build a company, that you can take that risk. Obviously, there's a lot of other practical factors that come into it, but half of it is also your confidence, your psyche, and your understanding that I am in a uniquely good position to do this. There's a reason that I am equipped to do this. To making that jump, obviously, half of it has to be based on data, and half of it has to be based on, the idea that I can do this if I believe myself in it, and also that if I'm willing to put in the time, research, and discipline, right? Because making your own company, I know it's like requires a lot of discipline and structure. Making your own structure, it's like you have to put on many hats, right? And so understanding, even when you're at a large institution, if you're ever thinking about it, seeing how people lead, right? Seeing how does management work? What are the errors you see with management, right? Or like if you're looking at, that's the beauty of working in large groups too, or like working with engineering and product teams, like you can see where the miscommunications happen. You can see where the pitfalls happen. That's one of the best lessons of being at a big institution, is you can learn how to build an effective company from the ground up if you learn from other mistakes, if you learn from other patterns at larger companies. There's a reason they're thriving today, but it's also important to be observational, right? It's also important to apply the lessons you learn in your corporate job or you're at the big company to how you choose to lead and build your own company, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And what are you most excited about in terms of the future of consumer research and behavioral analytics?
Yeah. I think in terms of consumer research, behavioral analytics, I think there's a lot happening sociopolitically in the world. I think it's from an academic perspective. We're lucky that we're at a point that we're collecting a lot of data and information, and we're in the digital age. And I think even research academically and business research has evolved a lot, which is great because I hope things are, we're looking at these events in time and we'll be able to understand um, how consumers behave, even like looking forward, and it'll give us a better understanding of like how large geopolitical shifts or economic shifts actually affect consumer behavior, even like purchasing behavior, because if you look back, I think, obviously history has been turbulent, but we haven't always had data on how we have people spend. We didn't have the means, and now we have the idea that like information and analyses are like easily accessible, but also like there's more and more people equipped to analyze it and research it, especially with all the coding skills and technical skills we have, or economic skills, right? So I think for me, what's, again, more data, but also the ability to analyze the data, model and predict, and especially with I spent some time doing machine learning when I was in college too, and I feel like a lot of it's very interesting because like obviously even AI too, like accuracy only improves over time, right? As these models get more and more refined. So I'm sure like a lot of that will help with even predicting consumer research and behavior in the future. Because even when we were modeling in the past, it was, it was iffy, right? And so as time and technology evolves, I think it'll be super interesting maybe how to see the consumer behavior can be predicted more easily or can't be. But that's the whole thing about behavioral science. You have to kind of, the idea that rationality exists or that is static, questioning that assumption is super important. And it might be the case that even behavioral science and finance and economics are all evolving. Even when I was in college, there were only like one or two classes that offered it. I'm sure it's going to be a growing field, and I think it'll be super important, because the even talking about like the risk, neutrality and love that we're talking about, people probably will invest differently in 20 years. People will purchase differently in 20 years. And modeling might be difficult, but that's the thing about collecting the data and just being able to analyze it in the near future. I think I'm excited to see what people come up with and what people foresee versus what actually happens. Does that make sense?
Got it. And if there's one point you could make to consumers on how they can better make informed decisions on where to spend, what would that be?
One piece of advice. I think it's kind of like it's don't taking a brand at face value is risky nowadays. I just think that's the truth. So it is worth doing research and having a holistic viewpoint of a brand, because while brand loyalty changes, also the time to make a shopping decision, the time to, dictate your purchasing behavior only grows, right? As all the options increase. So I think the more time you invest in figuring out what kind of values you support and you care about, or what kind of brands reflect that, the better it helps you also in like a few years. Because if you think about even like economic choices, right? You'll be able probably to defend those purchases and economic choices better in a few years if you took the time, if you kind of had an idea about like what a brand stands for. And I'm not saying anything is static, but that's why being an informed, conscious consumer is really important nowadays, because outrage and boycotts and stuff, the only reason it's happened is because we lacked information, and then we got the information, and now we're having this era where information is easily available, but are you consuming it? Are you choosing to read the things that are important? Are you choosing to follow brands that might be, you might have to take a risk and support, and if you move away from that bigger loyal brand that that you've cared about in the past. I just think it's important to research, but also important to experiment, because you never know until you discover a new brand to try. And I think also it's a good thing to keep an eye on, even if you invest. Like some of these brands, they might go public in 10 years. You don't know, right? So, and it sometimes a lot of times like you can tell, especially with ESG, people are divesting, people care about what companies do. And if you follow these brands, from the ground up, it's really interesting how you can have a sense about like even how your personal finance or portfolio can reflect the trends that are seen in consumers. Because a lot of times there's echo chambers, right, between consumer and investor kind of decisions and investments. So